final question, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
Man, you already brought up men's mental health, but I feel like that's actually started to show up a little bit more in the culture, which is fantastic. It might be helpful to start talking a little bit more honestly about the effects of politicization and starting to make a little bit more of a distinction between what is politics and what is personal. I
Mm.
think over the last few years, you started to see kind of this A plus B equals C understanding of the world become very popular. Saying the personal is political it's a rhetorical phrase. And while the political domain can overlap and often does overlap with the personal, there still are points where we need to be having a conversation of what the distinction is. And I don't know that we're making that distinction anymore or that differentiation anymore. I came across a piece a couple years ago. It was, I believe it was more of a left-leaning scholar. I would put money on that without knowing. But what they were describing was they said, the personal is political and the professional is political. And I said, well, doesn't that make the professional personal if they're all the same? And I think that's the exact claim that's being put forth right now that's got people maybe not necessarily always thinking clearly when certain topics are coming up. And again, speculating here, certain topics that are coming up that are emotionally charged, they can't really make those distinctions anymore. I often talk to people who are so afraid to talk about the political domain because they feel like it is going to be a personal affront of some sort, an offense that destroys the relationship. But in my view, the thing that destroys a relationship is what I said before. If there's an inability to dialogue and converse respectfully with maybe some humility and love baked into the cake, then it's all going to fall apart eventually. There's no way to have a sustainable relationship, conversation, society without that respect and humility and that possibility, that room for the possibility that you don't actually know all of the pieces at play. You don't know everything. And I think that we need to start talking about how to get people back to that space of it depends.
Mm.
Situation calls for the right approach. And it just simply depends. And we don't always know what that is. And we have some finitude baked into that as well. But we can find a way to be okay with that and we'll be all right.
Something I've been thinking a lot about is this idea of complex systems. Um, and that I think is a really fundamentally really important. So the idea of complex systems is different from a complicated system. A complicated system is, a 747 that is made up a bunch of component parts, and you can take it apart, you can fully understand it, you can put it back together, you can figure out like if this part goes wrong, you can track it and figure out exactly how the whole system will fall apart. In a complex system is more like weather or climate or human biology, where small changes can have absolutely unpredictable results. I think about the trans issues very much like this idea that that the human body is just a collection of parts, and you can just adjust hormones here and there, and now suddenly, you've turned a male into a female. It's not how human beings are. This is not how human societies are.
We don't talk enough about decolonisation and how bad it is for Western civilization. We get told that we have to decolonise the curriculum. Psychology is a really good one. We have to decolonise psychology. It's made up of far too many old European white men. Philosophy's the same. Socrates, etc., etc. We have to decolonise it and bring in more. Why? Yes, it's good to learn more about different philosophies, Asian philosophies, for instance, Far Eastern philosophies. Doesn't mean you have to kick the rest of it out the door. If I look at philosophy and the ancient Greeks, Socrates, Aristotle, so much of what we do now, so much of what we learned is from these white Mediterranean European men.
Well, I've been calling for institutional reform, serious institutional reform. The Congress is dysfunctional, and I've even thought constitutional reform is important. Our $3.7 trillion deficit is a problem. I mean, it takes serious structural reform to fix some of these things. I don't know how you get there, but to talk about structural reform, I think, is important. I don't know how you do it or what needs to be done, what the reforms are. But when Reagan once proposed a balanced budget amendment, I don't know if that was just a political thing or not. But I mean, that's a structural reform that you've got to build some of these things into the structure that that's binding. It gets over just day-to-day politics and these crazy shutting down the government controversies or funding this thing or not funding this other thing. The pathologies that are coming at us like a freight train are systematic and structural. The entitlement disaster is coming. The sovereign default is coming if we continue on this road. And none of these things they're paying attention to. So
The over application of psychotropic medication. That is the one, and I know it's been starting to get talked about a bit, but I know the psychiatrists get really mad at when that's said, as do the APR. But a lot of these drugs were designed inside the confines of inpatient treatment, right? Where you are being given these drugs alongside very rigorous therapy. And instead what happens a lot of the time is clients and patients are just given antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications or mood stabilizers or anticonvulsants, or I can go on and on and on, and are just sent off into the world and told, see me again in 2 months. Let me know how you're doing. We'll up your dose. We'll change the meds. And things don't tend to get better. They might have it may have an initial bump, right? Because the drugs are kicking in and they are doing something, but very quickly they fall back into problems because none of all these other things aren't being dealt with.
Great question. Aquascaping. Aquascaping is a great new hobby of mine where you have a fish tank, and instead of just putting like gravel and plastic plants, you could actually grow real plants in your fish tank at home, and then the fish swim around, the little garden that you made. And it's like indoor gardening plus aquarium ownership, and it's amazing. So I think there should be more talk about aquascaping, and people just, there's so much crap in the world, and there's always going to be crap. But I do think, don't overlook so many beautiful things that you could add in your life, that you could get obsessed with, right? And don't wait for everything to be fixed before you could feel amazing joy right now.
I would say the impact all of this stuff on children, and especially technology. I mean, it's being talked about, but not enough, right? Jonathan Haidt, he's been screaming from the rooftops for years, and more and more people are hearing it, but not enough. So I think this, the impact, because a lot of parents today, they started the technology, the smartphones that came out when they were maybe teens and so on. So they started doing that. And so I don't think we're talking enough about the impact of all of these changes in society. And again, I think it starts with the technology. It'll be with AI as well. I don't think we're really looking at what it's doing to the human, not just the mind, but the actual brain. I think that that's really changing what it means to be human. And we're seeing this. We're seeing that, that people are not they're not, let's say, mating as much. They're not having babies. They're not looking for, they're going, well, why do I need to do this? They just don't have this vision of a future. They don't see it as, wait, what's really valuable to me? They're being bedazzled by all these gadgets and the technology, whatever. They're not really thinking about, in the end, the existential question of why am I here? What am I doing with my life? I don't think that's being talked about enough to help young people and older people as well, but young people especially, have a sense of purpose, of meaning, of having values and trying to live by those values. We never really pushed that much in the old, well, I guess with religion we did, but I think more and more we're just losing sight of what it means to be a human being. Okay, especially in today's world, and we're just looking at all these gadgets, and we're looking at the easy way out, and we're not thinking about the consequence of that. So I think that's what's not being talked about enough. It's being talked about a lot, but not enough.
I think probably one of the bigger things is talking about with respect to mental health. What are things beyond medication and even psychotherapy that can help with mental health? Because I think there's a lot people can do in their day-to-day to improve their mental health. And yes, if you need it, it can be very helpful to see a psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist, what have you. But I think things I think a big one is physical exercise. I think there's a lot of evidence that's coming out in terms of the benefits of physical exercise for mental health, but not just mental health, but other physical health, sleep. There's a lot of evidence coming out in terms of how physical exercise can potentially be preventive in terms of cognitive decline as you get older, preventing dementia. Alzheimer's are the types of dementia. So I think talking about those sorts of things, behavioral interventions, the role of diet, obviously the role of substance use. I mean, something we talk about a lot, but um, I think there's not enough that we can say about it. And I think this ties back to my message of, I really like to help patients feel empowered in some way. I think it's important to convey to them that even if there's a lot going on in your world that you can't control, there still are certain things within your locus of control that you can do. So again, looking at your day to day, what can you do in terms of getting exercise? What can you change about your diet? What can you change about your sleeping habits, et cetera, et cetera. So helping people know that these are things that you can do and should do that will help you out. And that goes hand in hand with any other treatment you're doing, whether that be psychotherapy or medication. So I think really emphasizing those behavioral interventions, those day-to-day habits in promoting mental health.
I think the idea of suffering is the thing that I come back to the most because we can't avoid it. And in some ways, we've become complacent to it. I think of how expensive everything has become over the last couple years, and people are really struggling mentally and financially. And we just kind of shrug our shoulders and keep on going. People are in more debt. They're stressed out with their jobs. I see it and hear it in marriage counseling, and they don't know how to suffer well. That sounds ridiculous, but we just come back to this place of self-soothing and then ignoring problems until they manifest physically. It's the biggest reason people have physical issues is because they're not dealing with the things that actually stress them out. They're just numbing it. So my job is to teach people, how do we suffer well? That sounds ridiculous, but it's to deal with the hardships that we have that are in front of us and to really thrive even in the midst of difficult circumstances.
My big thing is just a general state of our polarization. I mean, I think it comes out in a lot of different ways, but it really hampers us from being able to solve our social problems because if someone has a good idea, we look to see if they have a D or an R beside their name, and then we decide whether or not we like the idea. And so, can we overcome that sort of polarization? I would like the church to be part of the solution. We're part of the problem. I don't think we're the source of the problem. I think we're part of the problem too often. And I'd like for us to be part of the solution. If we don't do it, we have to find some ways of lessening the polarization and not running to our social political corners every time an issue comes up and figuring out who we support, who we don't like, based on, do they have the right political ideas?
Right now, the big discussion that I'm following is nutritional psychiatry, looking at diet, nutrition, and the impact on mood. This is something that I've had my finger on for maybe about 8 years now. There have been very promising studies that diet can alter the course of things like bipolar disorder, ADHD symptoms. Some people are talking about diet improving autism symptoms. I'm thinking it's probably improving symptoms adjacent to autism, but the research is out there that there are dietary alternatives to medication. I was diagnosed ADHD when I was 7 years old. I was a Ritalin kid, hated it, didn't like how it felt. If I were told that there were nutritional alternatives, cut back on sugar, certainly not sugar in the morning, I think that I could have had better outcomes. There's also that critical developmental piece of the developing brain. What we are eating has an impact on how our brain develops. I don't know what school lunches looked like when you were going through, but we had these square pizzas and chocolate milk that were great. God have mercy on all of the teachers that saw us after our lunch hour because we were just carved and sugared out of our mind. You probably had to scrape us off the ceiling with a rake. Our prison system has done a lot of research into this. If prison systems spend actually not even that much more money than their previous food options, more protein, more vegetables, some fruit has sugar in it, but some natural food, we saw less behavior problems, fewer violent events. People were more civil.
people could follow the rules a little bit better. We learned this in prison systems. What happened overnight? All of the prison systems started utilizing this because they got to save money because there were less behavioral challenges with their inmates. Our schools haven't. Our prison system feeds our prisoners better than our schools feed our children. And I can't think of a single thing that benefits all American citizens better than feeding children healthy nutrition that will influence how their physical brain grows.
Family. I mean, I think really the whole core of society comes back to, traditional nuclear family, that fathers matter, mothers matter, parental rights over their own children. When you get so much of the social transitioning happening, in the public school system with the social emotional learning programs and the comprehensive sex education, we're seeing the absolute social contagion that almost always emerges in junior high school. And when you look at just, the psychosocial stages of development, that whole age, 11 to 19 is the identity versus confusion stage, which is perfectly normal, healthy development. But when you get agenda driven, curriculums saying, in kindergarten, part of the curriculum is reading Heather Has Two Mommies, or, all of these gender ideology books where there's no such thing as a transgender child until somebody tells them, maybe you're a boy, maybe you're a girl. Well, we are creating a mental health crisis. And I think we got to start focusing back on the families and the parents. You have legitimate legal rights to protect and raise your child. Don't let a school district tell you what they need to know about sex. You can, and I don't think a lot of families know that they can opt out of these programs. And I just don't think we're talking enough to families about, these are your children. The schools may say something, but ultimately at the end of the day, you have legal rights and authority over these kids to push back.
Something that I think would be helpful. I want to stick with my answer of discernment. I've been recently talking with young people, and I'm emphasizing teaching that more than anything. So many people have a difficult time in the world because they cannot discern feedback about their performance or feedback about the words they say in a given moment from feedback about who they are as an individual. And if we could talk about that more so people could learn that more, so that you could understand, for example, if you're a student and you get a poor grade on a test, or you write a paper and your paper wasn't very good and you get feedback on it, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're a bad writer. It means the words you turned in on that paper weren't the most effective words. And if you could learn this, it would radically change your life. It would radically change people's lives for the better.
Birth rate decline. It far more at the moment, our discourse, to the extent that it is talking about birth rates at all, we're seeing this growing emergence of this child-free trend, which I'm sure you can put, you can join the dots from what I've said already, what I think that is and where I think that's coming from and why it exists. We need to be talking about birth rate decline. We are not far away from population collapse with the birth rates that we have. It's dangerous to get into a conversation about immigration and, population demographics and things like that when, this is the last question and I don't have a lot of time to speak sensitively on the issue. So, but what I will say is that, we have a great civilization here in the West, and we do not want to see that civilization lost. And civilizations don't crash the way a building crashes down. Right? It doesn't happen in a moment. It doesn't happen at a point in time. It happens over generations, and it happens, I would argue, I'm going out on a little bit of a limb here because this is kind of a recent idea I've had, but I would argue that it happens via birth rate decline more often than it happens via anything else. So what happens is it's almost like an inevitable cycle. you develop a level of technology which gives people a level of standard of living and allows a certain level of luxury to develop. And what that inevitably allows is for women to access resources without going through men. If you no longer need men to toil very hard to produce the resources, and you can then gatekeep those resources from women except via marriage and children, which is the fundamental mating market exchange, right? That's the exchange. The men have the resources and they exchange them with the women for the children, and that's what promotes marriage and that's what promotes reproduction. As soon as a society reaches a point in time where women can access resources without having to go through men, birth rates decline. And it's not a passive process, it's an active process. Female intersexual competition drives the social changes that are needed in order for women to be able to access those resources. And once women are able to access those resources, intersexual competition focuses on demonizing men and defiling men and encouraging, the future is female. And what you end up with is female intersexual competition attacking background birth rates. I won't speak too much about the pro-abortion movement because it's awful, but anybody who still thinks that the abortion debate is sitting in the space of, rare and only when needed, is kidding themselves. It's not. Absolutely, it's not. And what you see is female intersexual competition driving birth rates down and down and down and down. And that population doesn't disappear though, right? If that population disappeared, then the mechanisms that select for women to do this would disappear as well. The only way those mechanisms can be selected for is because the women who survive that bottleneck become the founders for the next population explosion. So when you see civilizations collapse, they're not disappearing, but what happens is they're shrinking and they're being invaded. And the women who are left, the ones who won this intersexual competition and convinced everybody else not to breed while they were breeding, it's them and their daughters. They become the founding population for the next massive explosion. So the winners become the women who are overly represented in the next population. So this is why you sort of get this cycle. And so if we want, in some senses, that's a very bleak theory because it suggests that this is going to keep happening. And just like all of the great civilizations of the past have ultimately imploded, so too will ours. If we don't want that to happen, the best we can hope for is we can find an equilibrium point. To find a point where we identify the factors that are leading to birth rate decline and identifying those things that we can do to try and reverse that. And maybe instead of just the inevitable decline and collapse and replacement by a much younger civilization with very different values and very different views, which itself in time will become more progressive and will have more emancipated women who will then stop breeding, and the same thing will happen again. But if we don't want that to happen, if we want to keep what we have now, then we have to start talking about birth rates and we have to start talking about why they're declining and what we can do to stop that. And we have to stop talking about that in a way that takes as a given fealty to feminism, because that's the poison of it. That is the whole problem. And at the moment, my fear is that our society as a whole is not ready to do that. We're not ready to say that we're going to have a conversation that is not entirely framed around paying lip service to feminism. Because if we aren't allowed to have that conversation, then we will not arrive at the answer to declining birth rates. We just won't. It's not going to happen.